Okay, we are live now. Okay, dear. Okay, salam əziz dostlar. Deməli, bugün Bristol Universitetindən professor Tariq Modoodla multikulturalizm və millətçilik deməli mövzunu müzakirə edəcəyik ingilis dilində. Əvvəlcə təqdimatı olacaq professorun. Ondan sonra suallar alacağıq. İcazənizlə mən onu ingilis dilində qısa təqdim edim, ondan sonra davam edək. Hello, dear professor from Baku. First of all, let me thank you that you accepted my invitation, and let me give a brief impression about you to the audience. Professor Modood has been studying multiculturalism since maybe 1990s, roughly 30 years. And his approach to the study of national multiculturalism differs from other scholars in terms of its relationship with nationalism, national identity. So we'll have a presentation of Professor Modood first, and then we'll get questions from the audience. Okay, let's start. Okay, go on, please. Yeah. Please. We can't hear you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for this invitation, Professor Valiev, and I'm very pleased to be here. It's my first interaction with students and researchers in Azerbaijan. I have been invited to visit Azerbaijan conferences, but unfortunately, I've never been able to make it. So it's good that now we can do this online. So let me share my screen with you because I will be speaking to a PowerPoint. Here you are. So this is my PowerPoint. This is the name of my center. It's called Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship. It's at the University of Bristol in England, Britain. This is today's talk. So let us begin with nationalism. I think someone may need to mute. I could hear a baby. Maybe it's you, Naza. I don't know. Somebody maybe who doesn't have their mute on. So a lot of people will say the whole idea of multicultural nationalism is an oxymoron or a contradiction. How can we have these two things together? So I'd better say what I mean by nationalism. Now, there are many kinds of nationalisms. So to catch them all, I offer this rather simple two-step definition of nationalism. Firstly, I have, as you can see, a minimal definition where I say nationalism is a societal perspective or a politics that gives normative significance to the national. Secondly, I say, and connects it to other things that have normative significance. And connects it to other things that have normative significance. The more things, the more nationalist. So then we get towards a maximal definition. So this is my definition of nationalism. So it has certain implications, this definition. Firstly, because nationalism is varied, there are different forms of nationalism, to accept one kind is not to necessarily accept another. So I doubt if anybody would want to accept all possible forms of nationalism and they're not logically obliged to do so if they accept one. So if they think of themselves as a nationalist, you know, political or intellectual nationalist, they're not obliged to accept all possible forms of nationalism. Secondly, othering, you know, where we create some other group of people that we say is the opposite of us, is different to us. Othering or exclusion of those people from us, from our country, from our group. Exclusion is involved in some kinds of nationalism. I mean, in a way, this is perhaps pretty obvious because we all know that so much nationalism works like that. But my point is that this othering or exclusion is not part of the core definition of nationalism and does not capture the normative character of nationalism. So you can see if I go back to my previous definition, you can see that exclusion is not a part of my definition of nationalism. And as I say, I don't think, even though a lot of nationalisms do have a logic of exclusion and perhaps a political goal of exclusion, I don't think it is necessary that the normative character of nationalism has to have exclusion. That's not what primarily nationalists are trying to do. So what do I connect nationalism to? Given my definition that nationalism is giving normative significance to the national and then connecting it to other things, what do I connect it to? Well, firstly, the state, you know, whether it's the United Kingdom, France, Azerbaijan, the United States of America, we have these states that we think of as national states, and that's quite central to their character. Secondly, to citizenship, that we are citizens of a particular polity. Again, you know, Azerbaijan or America or Britain or Canada and so on. So these are national citizenships. And thirdly, belonging, because we can belong to lots of different things. We can belong to our university, we can belong to our city, we can have a great sense of belonging to a football club. But one of the things that many people have a sense of belonging to is their country, to a national or the national. So those are three things that I would want to make a normative connection to with the national. And they are quite common. So really the distinctive thing that I'm doing is in item number 4, is making a normative connection between the national and multicultural recognition or inclusion. So that's really the distinctive feature, and that's why, of course, I call it multicultural nationalism. So all these things that I've got on the slide here, they all have some historical cultural character which cannot be reduced to rights. What I mean by that is that, of course, citizenship includes rights. You know, the right to have a case tried in law according to due process, for instance, the right to vote in a democracy, the right to live within the territory, and so on. But state citizenship, belonging, and so on, they're not just about rights, because they all have a particularity. They're about the French state, or the American state, or the German state. And these states are different. They have a different character. They have a different historical, cultural character. Their difference doesn't simply lie in the fact that they may have different laws and different schedule of rights, though that will be part of their character, certainly, and that's clearly historically influenced. And if they are historically and culturally formed entities and objects, then that means that the nationalism that I'm talking about is a culturalist as well. Oh, I just got a message saying the recording is stopped. Is there a problem? Daimur, are you in charge of the recording? Oh, good. Now I've got a message saying it's in progress. Good. So what I was saying was, so these states and citizenships, they have a culturalist character. They're not just a form of civic nationalism. What I'm talking about is not just a form of civic nationalism. Maybe you've come across the term civic nationalism. It's quite prominent in nationalism studies that people divide various forms of nationalism into civic and ethnic, for instance. Well, I don't want to do that. What I want to emphasize is the nationalism that I'm talking about clearly has a civic component. There's not much doubt about that, but that it also has a cultural historical character. Let me now say something about multiculturalism to explain what I'm saying can be connected to a nationalism. So part of the normative core of multiculturalism is what I'm about to say. Two concepts of equality, or a double concept of equality. I understand classical liberal equality to be captured. Sorry, you must have heard some noise there. So classical liberal equality is captured by the first point on this slide, and if you like, by the first concept of equality, by which I mean equal rights or non-discrimination. So for example, one could say, in Britain we could say, if Christians are allowed to build churches, then why not some other group? Why not Muslims? Why aren't they allowed to build mosques? So that would be a fairly standard claim of equality and non-discrimination. And that is central to the idea of equality, including of multicultural equality. But note, this first right, this first concept of equality, has two aspects. It can be equalizing downwards, or it could be an equalizing upwards if we are bringing some people into equality with an existing core of citizens. And I explain this, I give example here on the slide. So by equalizing downwards, I mean something like this. Someone says, look, Muslims and Christians in Britain are not being treated equally because Christians have various rights and provisions, given by the state. For example, they have state-funded schools. So someone could say this is not fair to Muslims. Therefore, we should abolish those Christian schools or any other provisions to Christians by the state. That is to say, we should bring Christians down to the level of Muslims. That's why I call it equalizing downwards. But that's not the only way to achieve equality. In fact, it's not even the standard way. More often than not, we seek equality by equalizing upwards. So in my example here, it would be giving Muslims and others the same provision as currently enjoyed by Christians. So Muslims too should be allowed to apply for and have state-funded faith schools, as indeed they now do in Britain. But there was a time when they didn't. So we had to argue for that. We had to have a political campaign arguing for equalizing upwards. Muslims weren't interested in equalizing downwards. They weren't saying to the British state, oh, Christians are given these various provisions. We're not happy about that. They shouldn't be given these provisions. Oh dear, I've got another message coming saying that recording is stopped again. Is this a technical problem? Is this a connectivity problem?
Oh, I think it's okay. I can hear you.
No, but the recording has stopped.
No. I think it's recorded by the uzun. Sorry.
Could Timur confirm that recording? Right, now it started again. Okay. Good. Okay, it'd be good if it didn't come on and off. So Muslims did not say to the British state, look, Christians have funded schools. They should not be allowed to have funded schools because we're not allowed to have funded schools. So they are no superior to us. They're equal citizens to us. Therefore, they shouldn't be allowed funded schools. No Muslims, or very, very few, none that I know of, argued that. They argued the opposite. They said Muslims, as equal citizens to Christians in the British political system, should be given the same rights and opportunities, the same provisions as Christians. And basically, the multiculturalist presumption is to consider the possibility of B, equalizing upwards, before A, equalizing downwards. That is to say, to avoid any form of downward movement or loss or dispossession on the part of a body of citizens. I'm not saying that's always possible. Perhaps we can think of some examples where that wouldn't be suitable. But on the whole, I take the multiculturalist thrust, the multiculturalist presumption, as I called it just now, to avoid a downward equality, which would mean loss for somebody. Rather, we want a gain for somebody. We want to include Muslims into the equal, into an equal situation to have the provisions that Christians do. So it's a win-win, no loss for anybody. So that's the first concept of equality, this concept of equal rights, but equalizing upwards. And this can be understood within classical liberalism, by and large. But the multiculturalist contribution to our thinking about equality and to equal treatment is actually in the second concept of equality. So this is equality as respect for difference, which can require differential treatment, as the important thing is to focus on a group's needs, as well as on what provision is generally available. And again, let me give you an example. Christians have no dietary needs. Now, in Britain, at least, they don't have any. They used to. When I was a boy at school, quite a long time ago, when I was a boy at a school in London, the school never served us meat on a Friday, because actually there is a Christian tradition which says that Christians should not eat meat on Friday. They should eat something else. For some reason that I don't know why, but for some reason, most Christians in Britain no longer observe that rule. They've given up on that rule. They used to. And so when I was at school, we were always served fish on Fridays, not meat. Every other day we had meat, but not on Friday. But my point is that even if Christians have no dietary needs, and they say that currently they don't have any dietary needs for their children at school, nevertheless, that is not a reason to deny Muslims and Jews kosher and halal meals at school. Because the needs of a group should be judged in its own terms, not simply whether some other group, the larger or the dominant or the majority group, has it or not. And so what I'm arguing here for multicultural equality is exactly the opposite of what is argued in France in relation to French state schools, French Republican schools. Because there they say, oh, we can't possibly give Muslims halal meals at school, because that would be to give them a privilege. Because we don't do this for Christians, then of course we can't do it for anybody else either, and we don't want to. Well, I say that's wrong. The reason we don't do it for Christians is because Christians have no dietary need. They don't ask for it. But if another group does have a requirement, then we meet that requirement, unless meeting that requirement is too expensive or harms someone, So I can imagine some vegetarians having an objection, but then they'd have an objection to meat being served on any day of the week, and not just halal meat, but any kind of meat. So that would be a different kind of objection altogether. But the objection that says Muslims can't be served halal food at school because Christians don't ask for any special kind of food, that I think is a bad argument, and it's the opposite of multiculturalism and opposite of what I'm arguing for. So let me now elaborate, let me unpack more my understanding of multicultural equality. And I'll do that by making four main points, two of which are on this slide. So firstly, multicultural equality is about protection from and challenging racism, cultural racism, and Islamophobia, including in dominant or majority culture in relation to laws, laws, rules, or opportunity structures and representation, how a society presents itself. So multicultural equality is challenging the racism in dominant or majority culture. But it's not challenging the majority culture per se. So multiculturalism has nothing to say against the majority culture just because it is the majority culture. It has something to say against the majority culture if it's racist or has racist aspects, because those do need to be challenged, those do need to be taken out or dismantled. So multiculturalism is about challenging stereotypes and negative portrayals of minorities. It's also about allowing minorities to replace the negative images with positive images, what in the political theory literature we call challenging misrecognition for the sake of recognition. But it's not challenging the majority culture per se. You could say, in a way, that multicultural equality involves recognition of the majority culture as well as recognition of the minority cultures. My second point of multicultural equality is there should be no insistence on assimilation, but nor should there be any hindrance against uncoercive social processes of assimilation or self-chosen assimilation. So people say, oh, multiculturalism is the opposite of assimilation. Well, yes, it is, that's true, but it's the opposite of an imposed assimilation, of the pressure to assimilate. If people choose to assimilate, you know, if they're from a minority, like British Muslims are in Britain, or other minorities in Azerbaijan, that's fine. Assimilation doesn't have to be encouraged, but nor does it have to be prevented, and it shouldn't be prevented. That means you're giving minorities the choice. And it's not a binary choice, meaning that they have to choose one thing or another. They have to choose the minority culture or the majority mainstream. They may want to do both and to adapt both in their own way. And that is exactly what multicultural equality allows for, enables. And so you could say that for a multiculturalist and for multicultural equality, different modes of integration should be equally welcomed. Assimilation can be welcomed, integration can be welcomed, but multiculturalism also should be welcomed. You know, people wanting to emphasize and gain recognition, respect for distinctive minority identities. That too is a genuine mode of integration and should be equally welcomed. There should be no single top-down model of integration, you know, with the state imposing a model of integration. Rather, there should be two-way integration. Both parties, if they are minorities and a majority, or the minorities and the state, there should be two-way integration. And moreover, this may take different form for different groups. Religious minorities may integrate in a different way to minorities defined by color, by racist coloring, you know, like anti-Black racism. So a group whose religion needs to be accommodated, in contrast to a group where there's not such a major issue. Yes, we'll end up with a different forms of integration, but that's fine. Multiculturalism, in that sense, is a genuine multi. And I've described that as a kind of a varied geometry, because integration doesn't take one form, but various forms. So that's two important aspects of multicultural equality, but there are two more. There should be multicultural accommodation of minorities within shared public institutions like schools. So in a way, I've already talked about that when I've talked about food. I think in the common school, you know, in the common state school, we should have a compulsory subject that everybody should study together in the class, namely religious education. Everybody should study that, and they should study it together, and they should study it in the same way that we study history or geography, or if you like, mathematics. That is to say, no particular religion should be promoted in that class, in religious education classes. Everyone should be studying it, and we shouldn't just be studying doctrines. We should be studying the effects of religion in history and its effect today in our society and in the world in general. That's what I understand by religious education. But in addition to that, not instead of that, but in addition to that, and on a voluntary basis, so religious education is compulsory, but what I'm now about to mention, on a voluntary basis, and I'll call this religious instruction or worship, this should also be provided by the school if it is requested. If a minority says, we would like to have some classes on Islam in the school, or we would like to have a place of prayer, place to pray and worship, then even if the majority doesn't want that for itself, the minority should be able to have it. That was exactly the point I was making about halal food, but it's not a point only about halal food. But this should be voluntary. No one should be forced to this. So I'm against people saying, oh, you are a Muslim, therefore you must go to the Muslim class. No, it's voluntary. If the Muslim child or the Muslim parent of that child doesn't want that child to go to that class, then that's fine as well. So that's an option, not a compulsion. And finally, the fourth point about multicultural equality is that minorities should be able to make claims on the national culture and identify with it in their own ways. And this remaking of national identity is part of multicultural citizenship and should be welcomed and encouraged by the majority. So, for example, rethinking what it means to be British. This is what we've been doing in Britain. So we now talk about people wanting to be and are being Black British, or British Muslims, or British Chinese. We say, yeah, that's what it means to be British. There are different ways of being British. Not only one way of being British, that's to do with being white and Christian, or being, white and secular. So that is a very important feature of multiculturalism, that not only are minorities included in the national identity, and it should be allowed to belong to that country just like everybody else, but also that they can belong to it in their own way. They should be able to influence what it is to be British, what it is to be French, what it is to be Azerbaijani. It shouldn't only be the majority in the Azerbaijan country that says, oh, this is how you have to be. There should be space for dialogue, conversation, and negotiation. Of course, this takes a long time. It's not something that happens on day one of citizenship. It's, it can be at least a couple of generations. But nevertheless, it is essential to my understanding of multicultural equality. So some of you may have heard of something called liberal multiculturalism. And so you might think to yourself, well, how does multicultural nationalism relate to liberal nationalism? So I'd like to address that point. What is the relationship between multicultural nationalism and liberal nationalism? By liberal nationalism, I mean a view that says that there's nothing in liberalism to stop people identifying with a country and having a sense of, and a country trying to create a sense of national identity and belonging, that there's nothing illiberal. Of course, it can be done in a liberal way, we know that, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a liberal project. So if any of you have come across the writings of David Miller, I think he makes a very good case for liberal nationalism. You know, he's a very good exponent of liberal nationalism. And I think liberal nationalism is a tendency in some West European polities today. So what are the differences between what I'm arguing for and liberal nationalism? So on this slide, I present the key differences. I say that multicultural nationalism is about group recognition, including ethno-religious groups, and not just about individual rights or redistribution. By redistribution, we mean when money is taken from wealthy people in order to meet the needs of poorer people, meet the welfare needs of poorer people, or help to eliminate poverty, or help to create jobs, for instance. That's what we mean by redistribution. So liberal nationalism can be quite strong on redistribution. You know, it includes redistribution as one of its political goals. I'm saying that multicultural nationalism is not just about individual rights or redistribution, or about a secularized public space. Moreover, and this is the second point, liberal nationalists tend to think, following John Rawls and his idea that a just state is culturally neutral, liberal nationalists like Will Kimlicker advocate a cultural thinning of the national culture. They say, yes, there should be a national culture, that's fine, that's quite acceptable within liberalism, but it should be quite thin. Whereas I say that a multicultural nationalism doesn't necessarily have to have a thin national culture. It actually may require, probably requires, a pluralistic thickening, because to include minorities, you include aspects of their cultural identities, and that's thickening the national culture, not thinning it, because it's adding something. And in general, that is exactly how we should proceed. Additive, not subtractive, which again is a bit like equalizing upwards, not equalizing downwards. So we should include minority cultural aspects so that minorities don't feel alienated by the national culture. That's quite right. But that doesn't involve thinning necessarily. It might do, sometimes in some aspects it might do, but it doesn't necessarily. So that's not a good way of characterizing the national culture as multiculturalism in general. And so multiculturalism works with and builds on, not rejects, but builds on current forms of national identity, especially those that are being multiculturalized, or where there are political efforts to multiculturalize national identity, as in, for example, Canada, the United States, in Britain as well. Though, of course, in different ways in these different countries, and it can be reversed. It's not guaranteed, nor is progress always held on to. We can lose as well as move forward. I now come to my final slide, my last point, because I want to say that multicultural nationalism is a feasible alternative, is a genuine practical alternative to what I call here bad nationalism. So we know there's a lot of bad nationalism in the world today. We see it in front of us all the time. You could say the invasion of Ukraine is based on some bad nationalist ideas. So though I've been arguing for a form of nationalism, I clearly don't hold the view that all forms of nationalism are good. I think nationalisms that oppress minorities are bad. Nationalisms that invade other countries and that are militaristic are bad. Nationalisms that deny individuals basic liberties are bad, and so on. But what I want to argue is that multicultural nationalism unites the concerns of some of those who are currently sympathetic to majority nationalism. I hope that is clear, that multicultural nationalism is not against majority culture or national consciousness. It can be sympathetic to majoritarian nationalism. And, I would say about a third of the population in a country like Britain tend to be very nationalist or quite nationalist, majoritarian nationalist. And multicultural nationalism doesn't agree with them, but it understands why they're nationalist, why they feel the need for a nationalist sentiment and identity. But multiculturalism wants to unite that with people who are pro-diversity. And that's perhaps in a country like Britain now about a third of the population as well. And so multiculturalism unites these two groups of people, or these two sentiments, because another third of the people are in the middle. They're neither strongly majoritarian nationalist, nor are they strongly pro-diversity. They might be slightly pro-diversity, slightly majoritarian nationalism, or they combine both, or they can swing from one side to the other, depending on circumstances, depending on what is on offer at any one time. And I think if multicultural nationalism is on offer, we're more likely to win that third in the middle. And therefore, multicultural nationalism represents the political idea and tendency most likely to offer a feasible alternative rallying point to monocultural nationalism, because that is one of the dangers that we're facing today. There is too much monocultural nationalism in so many countries, not just in some parts of the world, in so many countries, including my own. And what is a feasible alternative to right-wing populist nationalism? Well, I think that multicultural nationalism has a better chance of winning a political consensus than many of the other politics that is on offer, politics to do with liberalism, cosmopolitanism, human rights, and so on. So that is my talk. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing the screen, and I'll be very happy to answer questions, to listen to your comments, to join in the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for excellent presentation, Professor. Firstly, I would like to ask the question, my questions, and I think that we have a broadened audience, and I think that we'll have questions. But firstly, I want to ask my questions. As you know, I have been reading your paper publications related to multiculturalism since 3 years when I was a PhD student in Turkey. So I defined my questions. Your recent paper, Multicultural Nationalism, was published in the United States. So your paper focused on minorities specifically, and you wrote that minority should not be involved zero-sum game with the majority. In this respect, you accept the dominance of the majority within the national identity. So Therefore, you use multicultural nationalism, a new approach to this study. So how could you define minorities as equal members of the nation in the context of multicultural nationalism? I think you said something, but I want to get expand answer. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. I think that minorities are treated equally when the two concepts of equality that I mentioned are operative to a large degree. So the first concept of equality, of course, is that everyone has some basic rights. And these rights are effective. You know, they should be effective. They're not always effective, of course, but they should be effective. They should be promoted by the government and other powerful groups in society, including, you know, like universities. They should be enforced by law courts. Where there is rights violation, it should be highlighted in the media. There should be political campaigns against it and so on. So that's one way of including minorities, and how minorities will include themselves. Because I think that minorities have to be active in the process of, as it were, equalization, the process of becoming equal citizens. Because being citizens is not a passive state of affairs. We become citizens, or we are citizens, through activity, through working together, but also arguing and criticizing each other, by contesting exclusionary ideas, for instance, by contesting forms of discrimination or unfairness. So that's one part of equality, or ways in which minorities can become equal parts of the nation or the national citizenship. The second part is more difficult, but it's what is distinctively multiculturalist. So the second part says equality is not just about sameness. It is also about recognizing legitimate difference, you know, genuine difference, difference that exists in the world and matters to people. It matters to people whether they are English or Welsh, you know, within the British state. It matters to people whether they are men or women within the British state. It matters to people whether they're black or white. It matters to people whether they're Muslims or Christians and so on. So these identities, especially the minority identities, which can be excluded, actively excluded, and have been actively excluded as a matter of fact over a long period of time, need to be included. Because yes, white people and men and the dominant groups, they're already included. So the task of multicultural equality is to argue for and to bring about the inclusion of minorities into the national citizenship, not just as individual citizens, but as citizens who also value particular kinds of cultural or related identities. And that means that we need to respect people not just as individuals or as fellow citizens in the abstract. We need to respect people as women citizens, as gay citizens, as Muslim citizens in the case of Britain. In Azerbaijan, it would be the other way around. You have religious minorities in Azerbaijan and a Muslim majority. So it's the inclusion of those religious minorities within the national citizenship and national consciousness and identity of Azerbaijan. So that's how we include minorities within what one might call a national framework, you know, so the national part can really matter as well. And that's why I call my position nationalism. Though a lot of people, including, you know, friends and other multiculturalists, say, don't call it nationalist. That's the wrong word, because you're not really a nationalist. It's the right-wing people that are nationalists. And I tend to think, no, I think I am emphasizing the national. We mustn't allow our opponents, we mustn't allow the right-wing monoculturalists to have exclusive monopoly over identification with the national. If we, you know, value our country, if we cherish our country, if it matters to us, and we're also multiculturalists, then we should aim to combine those two things, not give up on one in favor of the other, not be forced to give up one in favor of the other. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Professor. We have a question from Facebook, Kamran, Mir Kamran. He wrote that, hello again, Professor Modood. To what extent do you count conservative models of multiculturalism? This is definition by Kimlik within the gap. Anything worthy of being categorized as authentic model of multiculturalism? This is what he asked.
Yeah. You know, I have read Will Kimlicker talking about different kinds of multiculturalism. So he's talked about neoliberal multiculturalism, for instance. And I think I may also have read him say something about conservative multiculturalism. But I must admit, I can't remember at the moment what it is. So perhaps you could just give me a little bit of a reminder of what is conservative multiculturalism. I assume it's not the same thing as neoliberal multiculturalism, that's sometimes referred to as a kind of consumerism, where you want to enjoy various kinds of ethnic consumption. You know, like you want to eat Chinese food, and you want to listen to African music, and you want to encourage Turkish self-employment in Germany or Britain. So that's part of what I understand by neoliberal multiculturalism, where the state is not involved. As you can see in my idea of multiculturalism, the state is very actively involved, but not simply in a top-down way. It is involved through the actions of the citizenship, of the citizens, through the democratic process and through campaigns and dialogue and political debate and so on. So I'm not sure exactly what conservative multiculturalism is. Perhaps you or the questioner could just give me some clue.
Sorry. Okay. Can you hear me, Professor?
Yes.
Okay. I want to ask you a new question, if you don't mind.
Okay, so are we just dropping conservative multiculturalism?
Okay.
Does the questioner want to tell me what conservative multiculturalism is? Just remind me. I think
Okay.
I did read something about it.
Okay. He just added that.
Yep.
Let me repeat it again. To what extent do you count conservative models of multiculturalism within the gap? This is a definition by Kimlik. anything worthy of being categorized as authentic model of multiculturalism. Authentic model of multiculturalism. Is it clear?
Not really.
Yeah, actually, maybe he's interested in multiculturalism for a PhD study. Maybe he has different approach, maybe liberal approach of multiculturalism. Okay, let me ask you a new question, if you don't mind.
Yes, please do.
Okay. In your paper, you wrote the role of state. As you written, liberal nationalism focus on naturality of state. But you wrote that it's impossible to get a naturality of state, and specifically multicultural nationalism involves state and lets the states to control immigration and to get authority over the national identity. So how could you explain it, please? Because I think it's important point of this article.
Yeah.
Because most liberals critics this issue, this point that, for example, I share your view. I think like you, but there isn't critics. Okay.
Yeah. So the idea of the neutral state in the modern period is best expressed within John Rawls's theory of justice. So he strongly believed that the just state needs to be, as it were, as impartial as possible in relation to the kinds of people that live within the state. So some people will be, Christians, others will be atheists, some will be Buddhists. Obviously, we've got men and women. We've got people who love theatre and people who don't want the state to take their money through taxation and spend it on theatre or on the Olympics, on preparing teams for the Olympics. Some people think, yeah, great, we want to win lots of medals in the Olympics. Let the state train people to be the best in the world. Other people say, no, I don't care about the Olympics. I don't want the state to spend my money through tax on this activity. Some states promote a particular religion. Most Muslim majority states, for instance, promote Islam in one form or another. So John Rawls thought, well, this isn't really fair on everybody else, on the non-Muslims or on the person who doesn't care about sport, and so on. So that's what he meant by when he said that the just state is one that doesn't favor any particular cultural preference or commitment over any other. There are some exceptions to be made because, for instance, the state has to have a language. But actually, why does it have to be English in Britain? Well, I suppose there are practical reasons. It'd be very difficult if we said it had to be French. Most people can't speak French in Britain. But actually, any functioning state is not neutral. I mean, language is one very good example, but there are in so many ways a state reflects a particular history and culture. For instance, in my talk, I was talking about schools that teach Christianity. Well, why is it that they teach Christianity and not Hinduism? Obviously, this is part of this particular state. Now, some liberals might say, well, the state shouldn't be teaching any religion whatsoever. But what about literature? Should it be teaching novels, drama? A lot of people say they have no interest in those things. Why should the state be teaching that? So like that, one can go on forever. So I strongly believe that John Rawls's ideal of a liberal neutral state, which has become quite dominant in contemporary liberalism, especially amongst those liberals who call themselves, for instance, cosmopolitans, but also amongst those who call themselves libertarians. I think that is a mistaken ideal. We can't have a neutral state. So if we can't have a neutral state, then we have to decide what languages or language should be taught at school, what history should be taught at school. And once we ask those questions, we have to then ask, well, how can we do this in a way that is fair or just, which is exactly what John Rawls asked himself. But we now have to answer the question differently if we believe that his approach doesn't work, if there's no such thing as a neutral approach, a neutral state approach. So we then say the only fair way of doing it, the only inclusive way of doing it, is that the minorities as well as the majorities should be reflected in the national identity and in the way in which this national identity is promoted or is shaped. And of course, it can be reshaped. And multiculturalists are always seeking for it to be reshaped, because to include minorities it usually involves some reshaping of the national identity, of extending it, for instance, or, as I said in my talk, of taking out the discriminatory or racist elements so that we do have a more inclusive national culture. So I think that's the way that we deal with the objection from those people who say multiculturalism involves a culturally neutral state.
Okay, thank you so much. You wrote in your famous book, Multiculturalism, that multiculturalism is the issue of the 21st century. So, and we are witnessing and experiencing the raising of nationalism in terms of monoculture, for example, as in Russia and happening in Ukraine. Yeah. So, by saying that, do you mean that multiculturalism will change, how to say, the view of national state of 20th century?
21st century, yeah.
Yeah, 20th century.
Yes, 20th century nationalism change into something different in the 21st century. Yes, that is my hope, and I think it is possible, because we are now so much more conscious of living with diversity in a more inclusive and egalitarian way than we have been. Certainly in the countries I know about. So living with diversity has now become a serious political challenge. And the political challenge has a number of facets, but how to do it within a commitment to equal citizenship, I think is absolutely fundamental. So that's why I think that this will be a big part of the story of the 21st century. That's why I say it's a challenge to take the mono-nationalisms of the monocultural nationalisms of the 20th century and make them into multicultural nationalisms of the 21st century. So it's not clear that we're winning. We're making some movement. We certainly raised the issue, but at the same time, there is a lot of opposition or backlash against the issue in countries like Britain and the United States, all across Europe, really, and so many other parts of the world as well. We see it very, very strongly in countries like India and so many other countries as well, including Muslim majority countries. But nevertheless, I think that certainly in what we think of as liberal democracies, I think the challenge of diversity will move more in a multicultural nationalist direction than in any other direction. Yeah. I don't know whether you can see, Orkhan, but Vusala Hasanova has their hand up.
Yeah, I think she didn't ask a question, but let me check through the Facebook, because we shared it Facebook and the new questions. If they didn't ask, I can continue ask my question. So we don't have question, but I want to ask my question again, if you don't mind, Professor. So I got that you wrote that you mean that nationalism will be alive. Nationalism, but there are enough critics that nationalism should be limited, should be ignored. For example, in any audience, in Britain, in Turkey, in Azerbaijan, anyway, they think that nationalism threatening the humanity and universal values, etc., etc. So should be ignored. But you wrote that nationalism will be alive, but with multiculturalism. So yeah. How could you reply these critics?
Yeah. So in the 1990s, in countries like Britain, in the social sciences and humanities in universities in particular, but amongst the larger public, we had quite a strong current which said nationalism, or even the national state, is out of date, that it is being superseded through processes of globalization in general, and in the European continent by the processes of Europeanization through the European Union. That these were two very strong processes, and they were driven largely by international capitalism, the opening of markets so that capital could flow across the world, wherever people wanted to make an investment, wherever people wanted to create a factory, and so on. It doesn't matter what country they're from, what country they're going to. And that if this was happening and could not be controlled, and it was obvious that there was a movement towards economic globalization, that certainly couldn't be denied, that the next thing that would follow would be that just as capital moved around the world, labor would move around the world. People, workers, would go to where the jobs were. And we obviously have seen a lot of that as well. We saw a lot of migration. And to some extent, we're still seeing it, though a lot of the movement that we're seeing is actually not economic migration, but is forced migration due to things like drought and famine and other environmental conditions, like harvests failing, flooding, and of course, wars, civil wars or invasions. And we're, of course, at the moment seeing a very big movement of Ukrainian refugees and so on. So, which isn't the same as economic migration, and so wasn't really part of the globalization argument, except to note that it can happen. And the other thing that was driving globalization was an international human rights perspective. The idea that everybody has the same rights, or at least some basic rights, but these rights should be quite extensive. They shouldn't be just about protecting people from persecution, from torture, from being imprisoned without a trial, without a fair trial, without due process, and so on. They should be much more extensive than that. And for some people who call themselves cosmopolitans, these human rights should extend to, in some degree or other, should extend to the right to migrate. Now, the right to migrate, if you like, has two aspects. One is the right to leave the country you're in. So if you live in Azerbaijan, the right to leave Azerbaijan. Now, that is a right that most countries acknowledge most of the time. Perhaps not all the time, and some countries perhaps don't acknowledge it either. But most countries do acknowledge it for most of the time. The difficulty is with the other right. For migration to take place, there has to also be the right for the state that you want to go to let you in. So if people from Azerbaijan want to go to Germany, not only does the government of Azerbaijan say, yes, okay, you're free to go if you want to go, but the government of Germany has to say, oh yes, you're free to enter. And they may say, no, you're not free to enter. You need a visa, or we're not giving you a visa, or you are free to enter after we give you a visa, but only for a fixed period of time, 12 months or 2 years or something like that. So obviously, states still regulate migration. They still control migration. But the people in the 1990s that I was referring to, they thought that a dynamic had been set in place by the end of the 20th century, especially in liberal democracies, that would lead to less and less control over migration, and indeed the state, the national state, having less and less power relative to, for instance, multinational corporations like, Google and Apple and Microsoft, but also, in some cases, to supranational institutional control and frameworks, legal frameworks, of which the best example we have is the European Union. But look, they seem to have been proved wrong, because we've now, unfortunately, got lots and lots of anti-globalization nationalism, some of which is very extreme. So we've seen the United Kingdom leave the European Union, Brexit, and we saw in Trump a very strong anti-globalization movement and presidency. So I don't see the people who said nationalism is going away and cosmopolitan is the wave of the future as being proved right. Maybe they will in due course, I don't know, but at the moment they looked proved wrong. They look as if they took a particular moment and projected it into the future unreasonably, without, due evidence or without due qualifications. Now, someone could say I might be doing the same as well, and I certainly recognize that I can't make any confident predictions. Nobody can. But I just think that what we have at the moment and the dynamic that exists today, the dynamic where we have lots of diversity in many countries and people wanting to hold on to national identities and sometimes getting very anxious about a loss of national identity. When we have those two things taking place at the same time, we need some political solutions that address both these two things. And that's what I'm trying to do through the idea of multicultural nationalism.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor. I think we have a question from the audience who wants to ask her question directly, and we'll see her, Rusala Hasanova. Here, she has a question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for giving us such a chance.
You're welcome.
Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Mr. Professor. I just want to come directly to my opinion. Actually, I cannot say that I'm fully mastered the subject in terms of scientific approach, but I'm really for to approach each person in the society to be like an individual, regardless of their identity, race, roots, and so on. And we know as it's an ongoing process. I personally think that everybody should experience that to be tolerant. I mean, we should learn the tolerance. So my question is pedagogically. As we know, we are going on the process of globalization. So we should know and we should actually understand and comprehend the tolerance. So do you think that schools should have such a subject where students should be taught with hands-on experience practically? I mean, in order to learn the tolerance and what's tolerance and how to identify which right, which is wrong. So I mean, how the framework will be or could be if we take like such kind of step in order to teach the students, because we don't have such kind of subject in our schools, and that's really difficult for everyone to teach it later. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for your question, Rusala. I certainly think that schools should teach tolerance, or it partly depends on what we mean by tolerance. So let me explain. I think that in political theory, not so much in ordinary, normal social conversations, but in political theory, there is a tradition of thought that says tolerance or toleration is putting up with something or somebody. Because if we go back to the roots of religious toleration in Western Europe, for instance, it began after a long period of religious persecution, even very long religious wars, when there was a stalemate. There was no clear winner to those wars. You know, I'm thinking about the wars between Protestants and Catholics in Western Europe, for instance. And so both sides were exhausted and they had to live with each other, coexistence. So toleration became a principle which said, well, we will not persecute you. We won't embrace you. We won't fully accept you as equals in in our own state, in our own jurisdiction. What you do in a different jurisdiction is up to you. But we will tolerate you. So Catholics in Protestant states were tolerated, and Protestants in Catholic states were tolerated. I mean, that was the idea. It didn't happen straight away, but over time, that was the direction of travel. Well, that is actually quite a minimal political ideal, and it's certainly far short of multiculturalism. As you will have seen from my presentation, I talked about multicultural equality, which is about including the minority, you know, in old-fashioned terms, the tolerated minority, including that in to the full national life, into full citizenship, equal citizenship, not second-class citizenship. So I think that's what needs to be taught in schools, and we need to do it in schools, not just teach it, but we need to practice it, and we practice it by including everybody in the school, regardless of their background, by making provisions that meet the needs of groups. You've heard me talk about how schools need to offer, for instance, kosher and halal food to pupils. They need to offer not just compulsory subjects like religious education, but optional subjects like religious instruction in Christianity, or in Islam, or in Hinduism, if there is a request, you know, if enough pupils want it, or their parents want it, and they may not. I certainly know lots of Christians that say they don't want it, but I also know lots of Muslims that say they do want it, you know, in British schools. So I think we need to have the inclusion of diversity in a respectful way as something taught in the school, but also practiced in the school. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you for your question, Salah. I want to ask a challengeable question that you wrote a famous book. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's not easy being a British. Yeah. So is it? If I'm not mistaken, it was published in 1990s, right?
Yeah, 1992.
So I would like to ask that: is it easy being a British in 21st century?
Yeah. Well, I actually also published a collection of essays around, I think probably around 2015, I can't remember the date. And that was entitled, Still Not Easy Being British. So the answer is that it's still a problem. But, you know, for people like me, for minorities, for people who are not white, for people who are Muslims or Sikhs or Hindus and so on, it's still an ongoing issue. It's very much a live issue. But the direction of travel, you know, the movement is easier than it used to be. Yes, I certainly would say that. I think that most British people now are much more, they recognize much more that to be British doesn't require them being white or Christian or secular. So there was a recent opinion poll, survey opinion poll, just a few years ago, that asked someone, what do you have to be an X in order to be British? So for instance, do you have to be white to be British? And 84% of people said no. So when I wrote that book in 1992, if there was a survey then, I imagine the number would have been much smaller than 84%. So that means we are making progress in the right direction. The other questions in the survey were, do you have to be born in Britain to be British? And there the answer was roughly half and half. I can't remember the exact statistic. I think more than 50% said you didn't have to be born in Britain, but it wasn't much over 50%. It might have been 55%, but I can't remember the details. People said, do you need to speak English to be British? And the large majority of people, I can't remember the number, but it was a very large majority of people said, yes, you do have to speak English to be British. And I can see why. And that's why I think we should teach English, not only in schools and universities and so on, colleges. We should teach English to people who want to become British citizens as adults, you know, mainly because of migration. So the answer to your question, Orhan, is it's still not easy, but we're moving in the right direction, and inshallah it'll get easier.
Yeah, I think we don't have any more questions, but this is just great opportunity for us listening your speaking. So thank you so much again, and I think it will have a contribution to the study of multiculturalism and nationalism in Azerbaijan. And so I want to get new, how to say, promises for the next conference, maybe more broad audience from a university of Baku. So thank you so much again, and good luck. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much again for your invitation. I've enjoyed being able to present to a group of people in Azerbaijan, and I'm very impressed that, you know, more than 35 people joined this session. So I hope you've all learned something from it, and good luck in your studies, and good luck in the development of multicultural nationalism in Azerbaijan.
Thank you so much. See you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.